It's my great pleasure to have for this Shabbat service Doug Haynes with us. Professor Haynes is Vice Chancellor for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCI, the Director of the UCI Advanced Program, a professor in the History Department. He holds a PhD, an MA from Berkeley, and a BA from Pomona College. And I want everyone to remember that when we felt the great tragedy of the murders in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, and we had our sanctuary full, people from our synagogue, from the Jewish community, the Muslim community, the African American community, Christian churches, politicians. The first person I thought to call to invite to be a speaker was Douglas Haynes. So Doug, thank you for being there then, and thank you for being here now at our service.
Thank you so much, Arnie. Appreciate it.
I want to ask you about, first of all, your work at UCI for inclusion and diversity, and exactly what you're doing in terms of the community and the campus.
Right. Thank you so much. And I just want to acknowledge your long service to the city, the county, the state, and the country. And this is very personal because our different faith communities used to share space.
Right.
And my kids had the benefit of listening and learning from you. UCI is a relatively young university. And one of the, I think, powerful features about it is the consciousness about trying to be intentional about what we call inclusive excellence. And it's the idea of defining our excellence in relationship to how diverse we are. And it's not enough to simply be diverse. We want to be sure that people thrive, that it's a place where people are affirmed, where they're supported so they can be their best self. And I think through my Office of Inclusive Excellence, we really work to do four things. One is to create a community where people expect equity. And that's so important, that they support diversity, practice inclusion, and honor free speech. And I realize that for some folks, these are sort of broad general notions, but there's a heavy responsibility, I believe, that goes with it. And so we insist that you simply can't be about expecting equity without advocating for someone else. Support diversity without actually understanding our very diverse communities that make up UCI and the greater Orange County area.
And UCI is a very diverse community. A lot of people don't realize that. Now, you've held community programs. I've participated in a number of them. You've brought in speakers, or I've been on a panel. So I know you're addressing the campus and the broader Irvine, Orange County community in that way. What's the purpose of utilizing the university to broaden our understanding of each other? I'm not thinking now of students,
right,
important as that is, but the university is playing a very important role in sort of town-gown relationships. What are you trying to achieve?
I appreciate that. I think first and foremost, to serve as the public square for Orange County and the over 3 million people who live here. I think it's a unique responsibility of a public research university to bring the knowledge to people and to create a context for debate, discussion, and dialogue. And one thing we try to stress about the program as we mount is we're not trying to change anyone's mind. However, we want to give people food for thought. And so in some sense, we allow people to have a debate about a subject in a civil way that may be very controversial, but I think too often in our public spaces and online, there's really little tolerance or no tolerance for actually debating in a respectful way.
And I have to say that the programs that I've attended there, I have heard the voices of people often that I would not have heard. It really was education in the best sense, really being able to think and ask yourself basic questions about your own assumptions before you walked in the door. I want to ask you some personal questions now.
Sure.
We've known each other for several years now. How do you feel now that we're going through this incredible tragedy of the murder of George Floyd and the revelations of things, of course, we knew about, but maybe didn't pay sufficient attention to, the brutality by certain police, not just in Minneapolis, but around the country, and about systemic racism and the marches that are going on. As someone who is African American, how does this all make you feel?
I had a real moment where it all came down on me at the same time. And I just started crying uncontrollably. And I'm, of course, older, and crying is fine, it's acceptable. But part of it was just the realization that too often it requires Black people to be murdered and brutalized for us to be seen. And, George Floyd is certainly the latest example. There's too many others, but there's even more involved in my emotional reaction. It's the recognition that there are these, there's a grievance about how police conduct themselves, how the criminal justice system criminalizes Black people. And in articulating that, I can realize how some people would be totally surprised and would prefer to see our system as generally very good. But part of that emotional moment is the recognition that there but the grace of God go me.
And I'd like to ask you about that. There is such a thing as polite racism, right? There shouldn't be something like that, but a delusion that a person has that they aren't racist, but in their behavior, they exhibit it. There was the term from 50 years ago, benign neglect. The way to deal with minority communities is to take attention off of them rather than to put attention on them. You have been in many white circles, professionally, academically, throughout your very distinguished career. Are there instances that you'd like to share with us of people who were racist, perhaps without intention? I'm really thinking of kind of white liberals who don't think about things like white privilege, who say things, or the way they look at an African American, or which might be patronizing, or might be insensitive. It may not be intentionally racist, but you feel it. Just as I am aware, as someone who's Jewish, when I'm in very non-Jewish crowds, sometimes I feel that sense of difference, and it's not intentionally in any way anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, even in a mild sense, but there's a lack of awareness of who I am and how I'm the same and different. Do you feel that as a Black man?
Yes, and that awareness has changed so much as I've grown and matured, learned, and experienced so much. And I want to use a couple of examples. I still remember when a group of friends, and I grew up in San Francisco, and two friends, both were white, and we were a really tight group. We're about 11 or 12, and we decided we're going to get identical sweatshirts. And so we marched down to the store, and we picked out the same color, and we were at the counter, and the salesperson collected the money, put the sweatshirt in the bag, and gave it to each person. And I was the last one to be served. And what was striking is that I was so excited about this opportunity to reaffirm our sense of friendship that I didn't even pay attention to the fact that the clerk didn't put my sweatshirt in my bag, but he did it for the other two.
Wow.
And what was striking is that one of my friends asked, why don't you put his sweatshirt in a bag? And I was so stunned by that, in part because I didn't want attention drawn to me. I just wanted us just to savor that moment. And I was so desperate for that I was just going to tolerate this person that completely engaged in either unconscious or conscious racism. But that's one example of someone at a very young age recognizing how someone could be treated differently because of their race.
And those stories stay with us, don't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which brings us to fast forward now that I'm a much more mature person. One way, particularly in academic communities that are dedicated to these wonderful ideas, where the anti-Black racism occurs, is just the complete ignorance or willful indifference to absence. Why are Black people absent? Why are their numbers so small? And too often, even in a highly sophisticated environment, it's striking the ways in which people are willing to use excuses as explanations.
Can you give me an example of what you're thinking?
One example is when we were searching for, let's say, new faculty, it's not uncommon for folks, well-meaning folks, to say, well, we tried. There aren't any. And what's striking is that those statements actually too often aren't grounded in fact, right?
Yes.
They're, in some sense, invoked to minimize or excuse actions. But the data does show that nationally, X percentage of PhDs and whatever are African American. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that one form of benign neglect is just the refusal of not to be interested.
Yeah, and you do have to want to be interested. You have to want to search out diversity. It's easier to just talk to the network of professional colleagues and not dig deeper. I mean, that's a very important role that you play at UCI, right?
Yeah.
It's to help raise awareness of the possibilities of a world that's more reflective of reality.
Here's an example. I think the campus is improving. And so this year, we will have hired the largest number of African Americans in the faculty in any one year, certainly at UCI, and I would argue across the entire 10 campus system. It's quite an astonishing achievement that has been a work in progress. But the reason why I mention it is, it's not enough just to hire people, because it's not unlikely or uncommon that very often they may be the first African American ever in a department. And so hiring is wonderful, don't get me wrong, but it's also important to remember that we sort of operate within our own sort of cultures that very often assume certain beliefs about race, culture, and identity. And so if you're not curious, if you're not introspective, if you're not prepared to apply your learning skills, it's not too surprising that the climate can be particularly unpleasant for people who were hired into it. And so again, it comes back to what I like to think of as moral leadership, that you have to make a choice. You have to ask the question. You have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to hold yourself accountable as well as your coworkers and peers.
You know, there's a difference between welcoming and inclusion, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Right? Welcoming is you escort the person into the door. Inclusion is you treat them as an equal, as a partner. Right?
As a partner, asking questions that may involve having to change yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that it's easy to feel that if we're at, let's say, a school, a university, that this is an inherently progressive organization, to think that I've done enough or I don't need to do more. But actually, the death of George Floyd is an illustration how if you choose not to act, bad things happen. Because George Floyd wasn't killed by just one officer. There were a group of officers that were there, but none of them chose to act.
And there was a union that every officer knew would defend them to the last iota of, So let me ask you about the term white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean to you? You know, a lot of whites, and I felt this way when I first heard the term white privilege.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, you know, what does that mean? You know, is that trying to make me feel guilty? I'm talking about when I heard this term a decade ago or whatever. But I've come to firmly believe that white privilege is there. You know, that we shouldn't feel guilty about it. We should be responsible to do something from that place of power that we have. Mm-hmm. You know, it is a birthright, not in a good sense, but it was presented. We were born into a society. We were automatically seen in a certain way that often minorities, Latino minorities, blacks, mm-hmm. are not seen in that way. Whites are often seen as safe. Blacks are seen as a threat. Mm-hmm. And, you know, all these stories you hear of people, let's say like you, who have impeccable, you know, upper middle class credentials, incredible education, just because you are black, you can be stopped by a cop when there is no way, if I were driving, I would be stopped by a cop, right? So to you, what does that term white privilege mean?
And thank you for asking that question, Artie. White privilege refers to unearned advantages based on a system that privileges people who are designated white. And so that means that within the US context, we know there is a racial economy whereby if, for example, you are a racialized black, within the society, you are subject to differential treatment, right? Through no fault of your own.
Right.
And just as white privilege is about advantages that are unearned, it relies on a larger system that disadvantages other people, right? So for example, to return to your example of policing, one thing to remember when it comes to the relationship of African Americans to law enforcement, it's not that we don't think that law enforcement's a bad idea. I think the vast majority of people says law enforcement can serve a very constructive role in society. The problem is that within our society, we know, based on experience, that every aspect of policing and the justice system involves a presumption that we've done something wrong, that we have done something wrong, or that we will, right? And so just to further put a point on this, I'm sure you heard that many Black parents instruct your young children or their siblings about how to comport themselves in relationship to a police officer. And one thing that's important to remember is that that conversation is profound, because in that conversation, a parent is conveying to their child, whom they love, whom they see as innocent, that child is no longer seen as innocent in the world, and that they have to behave as if they're guilty. And so as you grow up, you start seeing these examples of other Black people being brutalized, if not killed. And one consequence of that experience is that when you encounter a representative law enforcement, not for all, but for many, it triggers. It triggers this loss of innocence. It triggers this fear that encounter might be your last breath. But more than that, it triggers the fear that if you die, you will be presumed to have been guilty. And so white privilege, as an example, includes not having to deal with that.
Yeah, and I imagine it's the hardest thing for a parent to do, just like causing pain to a child in any way, to give that talk and say, and there's nothing that I can do about it, right? Parents say, in other situations, this is how I can help you. But this is one where you have to say, you have to do these things to protect yourself. And it's a terrible talk to have to give, and sadly a necessary one. So what does the term systemic racism mean to you? Is there, when you say systemic racism, or do you see it everywhere, or do you see it in some places more than others?
I think it refers to, again, how within U.S. society, race plays such a powerful role. In some ways, it's very explicit. In other places, it's very subtle. Yeah. And so here's an example. When you look at, for example, home ownership, which is something that most Americans really aspire to. It's important to them. It's a way to sort of create stability. It's a status symbol. It's a way to transfer wealth to a younger generation. And if you work hard, save, you can own a house. But systemic racism works to really create a lot of hurdles and barriers. And so it means, one, that you have to complete your education, get a job. An overwhelming model of evidence shows that Black children are disciplined at far greater rates than other children, that they are disproportionately attending under-resourced schools, right? That affects what colleges that they can go to. And there's this continuing accumulated burden in the following way, that to go to college, the costs have to be borne by the student or the family. If you come from an economically disadvantaged family, you have to assume a great deal of debt, right? And so by the time you graduate in 4 years, you have a major financial obligation, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, in the world of work, you know, it's important to remember this phenomenon of implicit bias, where people are conditioned to sort of see people and slot people in different categories as fitting in, as a threat. And so in order to thrive in the employment environment, you not only have to have the qualifications, the education, the experience, that person interviewing you has to be sufficiently aware of their own biases to interrupt them, right? And so all of these factors that affect, you know, educational opportunity, support for education, persistence in college, getting a job, are links in a chain that allow people to own a house. And so systemic racism is real. It's not as ugly as it used to be in the Deep South, though sometimes we have examples of it. But it operates at the policy level, at the level of people's discretion in private. But it has this accumulated impact that can really disadvantage people in ways that I described.
No, I want to ask you about the work, your work on campus again, about diversity. I know that the Jewish community has been concerned for a while about some of the tensions, mostly dealing with Israel, anti-Zionism, maybe more than anti-Semitism, but it's very hard sometimes to draw the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. They kind of roll into each other back and forth. And a lot of your work has focused on reducing tensions in general. And I think we're all grateful to you for making the campus a safer place for not just free speech, but for responsible speech, or for organized speech, or for getting people to think about what they're saying. In your perspective, has anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism decreased on the campus? Was it always overblown, or was it real? And what have you done to reduce it to the much lower level that it is now?
I think the campus as an organization has grown over the past like 15 or 20 years. I think there are well documented incidences of individuals coming onto campus,
Right,
intent to provoke, to engage in anti-Semitic rhetoric. In other words, to exploit First Amendment rights on our campus, which had the effect of understandably causing our Jewish students, staff, and faculty and surrounding community to be outraged, be fearful, and wondering, what are we doing, allowing these individuals to come on this campus and engage in this behavior that is totally inconsistent with the values that we stand for as a campus. What's happened over the past, I would say, 10 years is that the campus has taken a far more robust approach. So instead of simply saying that's free speech, we now make it very unambiguously clear, to the extent that we can, that those views are inconsistent with what we believe in, right? And that also, you know, bleeds into the space of politics, right, that you sort of alluded to around the issues of Israel. There are some individuals that take a very extreme position about the state of Israel. And what we try to do is to mobilize our research and teaching and service mission to point out reliable information, right? And so we believe that it's an obligation of universities to actually understand and study and do research on these subjects, right? Yeah. So that at least our students have a framework of understanding. But I guess my final point is this, is that now it's clear now, particularly after Charlottesville, we can't stop, right? And that's why we have a confronting extremism program, because we simply can't turn away. We can't assume that it's going to go away, and we can't believe that other people are doing it.
I think we're all kind of shocked that the America that elected Barack Obama president has become a very different kind of America, perhaps partially as a result of seeing a Black president, and instead of cheering it on the way most of us did. I remember Michelle Obama's statement early in the campaign that she got criticized for, where she was exuberant and saying, something like, "I never knew this kind of America existed." I completely understood her feeling, but she discovered the possibility of America. Well, when Barack Obama was elected president, I think people of goodwill on the left, right, and center understood this was a watershed moment that would forever change America. And if we weren't in a post-racial America, we were in a fair and decent America. And then, and I'm not talking about any particular candidate or elected official, but what happened was, even during Obama's presidency, the Tea Party got stronger and more vocal. There were signs and slogans and stuff online that was so deeply offensive. The racism came out. And then during the campaign, David Duke came out. And there were people who said the most vile things about Jews and Blacks. And now we have Charlottesville and Pittsburgh, which Jews deeply felt. And we have Charleston and Minneapolis that African Americans felt. And the reality is, all of us should feel for all of those tragic moments, right? It shouldn't be Jews in their silo and Blacks in their silo. So what can we do over time to somehow recreate that America of possibility that was presented to the world in Grand Park 12 years ago?
Arnie, I think that we need to practice our beliefs and not assume or take it for granted. And I think in some sense, the 8 years of the Obama administration, which is an incredibly important moment in US history, at the same time, I could imagine allowed some people to think that we've done it. We've figured this out, right? And that was more superficial. There was so much more that needed to be done that should have been done. I think also our institutions of civil society are so critically important now more than ever. Our synagogues, our churches, our Buddhist temples, our mosques, our schools, but they need to educate more, right? Because we now are literally locked in a confrontation, a conflict with individuals and organizations that really feel that the America that they believe they had doesn't exist anymore. And they're prepared to do things for it. They're prepared to vote into office people who have values that are radically different. They're prepared to sort of support organizations that enunciate just awful beliefs about people and enable a culture where some folks are emboldened to act. And so I think it's the hard work that we do in the community. It's the hard work of undertaking moral leadership to help make this country what it should be. It's not easy. Sometimes it's unfair. Often it's the usual suspects who are engaged in this work, but we have to do it because we know if we don't do it or if we stop, the alternative.
Yeah, well, Dr. King said silence is betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And we just have to, people who consider themselves people of goodwill, people who talk about loving thy neighbor, have to stop being silent.
Well, Elie Wiesel said, you can't be neutral.
Yes, absolutely right.
You can't be neutral.
Is a sin. Indifference is a sin. Well, Doug, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I know how busy you are, and I really do appreciate this dialogue between us and this dialogue with our congregation and far beyond. So thank you so much for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you not virtually, but in person very soon.
I can't wait. And thank you, and thank your congregation as well.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.